This is part 6 of Theaetetus, the Platonic dialogue. Thus far we've been engaged in a conversation between Socrates and Theodorus. We have been steadily working on the theory of what we now know to be the school of the Ionians, which includes this Protagorean figure that state that all things are in motion. And from Protagoras we have the theory of, or the hypothesis of, that man is the measure of all things, and that this gets into the matters of perspective. This gets into the way that we experience the world, our relationship with it, our perceptions, our senses. And so now we have come to a fork in the road, where we've identified, rather, I think, disparagingly, the Ionian school. At this point, we seem to be weeding down more and more the argument that that school has provided. And it seems as though, in the last episode at least, we compared their strain, or their school, in line with that of the Gnostic tradition. That of a snake eating its own tail, that there really is nothing to be known, and what is claimed to be known is this sort of intangible, ineffable thing. And this unrelenting liberation that we find within the statement that man is the measure of all things, that as a matter of his perspective, what is true for him, and what is true for another man is true for another man. And of course this has led us into various different tributaries from the main conversation, different examples and so forth, that are in previous episodes, most of which seem to be unfruitful. The ones that remain are hopefully to be explored here. Now the other road here, I mentioned the fork in the road, the other road is the opposite. It is the one that thinks that there is a finitude to our experience here, that there is something of the whole, that there is an insistence that all things are one, and that this one, capital O, stands still, itself within itself, having no place in which to move. And so Socrates and Theodorus find themselves in between, sort of sandwiched in between these two theories, and they're going to explore both the merits and potential distractors of each. So Socrates says, "Then we must examine them, if you feel so strongly about it. Now it seems to me that the proper starting point of our criticism is the nature of motion. What is this thing that they are talking about when they say that all things are in motion? I mean, for example, are they referring to one form of motion only, or, as I think, to two? But don't let this be only what I think. You commit yourself as well, so that we may come to grief together, if need be. Tell me, do you call it motion when a thing changes from one place to another, or turns round in the same place?" Theodorus says, "Yes, I do." "Here then is one form of motion, that supposing a thing remains in the same place, but grows old, or becomes black instead of white, or hard instead of soft, or undergoes any other alteration, isn't it right to say that here we have motion in another form?" Theodorus says, "Unquestionably." So before we go further, I think it's an apt place to mention the modern scientific conception of motion. That's based on Isaac Newton, in the 17th century. He says that an object will remain at rest or continue to move in a straight line at a constant speed unless acted on by an external force. This is something that is known to most of us. It's common to us. There are three fundamental qualities to it, the first of which Socrates had mentioned here, displacement. We also have velocity and acceleration. And just for the matter of the purpose of definition, displacement refers to the change in position of an object. Velocity is the rate of change of displacement over time, and acceleration is the rate of change of velocity over time. And so again, he says, do you call it motion when a thing changes from one place to another or turns around in the same place? So displacement here. Now, I don't bring up Isaac Newton to make a direct comparison necessarily to Socrates, but rather as a reference to see what our modern conception of motion is, and compare it, well, I just said compare, but make a reference, just give us a perspective, another perspective. Then we can see how the definition of motion in the philosophical sense compares to that of something that is grounded in the physical, material world. And we'll see if perhaps if there's a separation here between the heavenly and the earthly in Socrates' description of motion. His second form of motion, a thing remaining in the same place but growing old, or becomes black instead of white, or hard instead of soft, or undergoes any other alteration. So this transformative sense is something that he is including under motion. Socrates says, then I now have two forms of motion, alteration and spatial movement. Theodorus says, yes, that's quite correct. Then now that we have made this distinction, let us have a talk with the people who allege that all things are in motion. Let us ask them, do you hold that everything is in motion in both ways, that is, that both moves through space and undergoes alteration? Or do you suggest that some things are in motion in both ways, and some only in one or the other? Now Theodorus says, heaven knows, I can't even answer that. I suppose they would say in both ways. Socrates says, yes. Otherwise, my friend, it will turn out that in their view, things are both moving and standing still. And it will be no more correct to say that all things are in motion than to say that all things stand still. Theodorus says that's perfectly true. Then since they must be in motion, and there is no such thing anywhere as absence of motion, it follows that all things are always in every kind of motion. Theodorus says, yes, that must be so. Socrates says, then I want you to consider this point in their theory. As we were saying, they hold that the genesis of things, such as warmth and whiteness, occurs when each of them is moving, together with a perception, in the space between the active and passive factors. The passive factor becomes such or such, but not a quality. Isn't that so? But perhaps quality seems a strange word to you. Perhaps you don't quite understand it as a general expression. So I will talk about particular cases. So it's worth mentioning here that there is a footnote after Socrates says general expression. The footnote reads, this is the first occurrence in Greek of the word, something in Greek I can't pronounce, or quality, or what sortness, coined by Plato from the interrogative adjective of what sort. So to continue, what I mean is that the active factor becomes not warmth or whiteness, but warm and white, and so on. You will remember perhaps that we said in the earlier stages of the argument that there is nothing which in itself is just one thing, and that this applies also to the active and passive factors. It is by the association of the two with one another that they generate perceptions and the things perceived. And in so doing, the active factor becomes such and such, while the passive factor becomes percipient. And so this is a good reminder of what happened earlier in the conversation. So what exactly does Socrates mean here? There's a lot of new language in terms of this episode in particular. So starting from the beginning, when he says, they hold that the genesis of things such as warmth and whiteness occurs when each of them is moving, together with a perception in the space between the active and passive factors. So here we have two concepts. We have whiteness and we have warmth. Now moving together with a perception, some individual's understanding, in the space between the active and the passive factors. What is this? So the active factor is the generative principle. It is the thing that is doing the acting. The passive is the finitude, the thing that is being acted upon, the substrate for which the active can create. The passive factor thereby becomes percipient, but not a perception. It's just receiving. It is not doing the sort of individual thought. While the active factor becomes such or such, but not a quality. So what does that mean? The active factor, again, the generative principle, it becomes this or that, but not a quality. So what is a quality? So our definition here of a quality, the quality refers to a characteristic or attribute that defines or describes something. It's a feature or property that helps identify, distinguish, or evaluate an object, person, or concept. Qualities can be objective or subjective, and they contribute to our understanding and perception of the world around us. So that is our definition of quality. So again, while the active factor becomes such or such, but not a quality. And he rightly says, interestingly so, but perhaps quality seems a strange word to you. Perhaps you don't quite understand it as a general expression. So I'll talk about a particular case. What I mean is that the active factor becomes not warmth or whiteness, but warm and white, and so on. So what does this mean? So remember, we said motion, and we mentioned something of change. And it's difficult to imagine something that lies in between two states. A passive and the active factor. You know, how can I suppose I could describe that I moved from point A to point B. Now, describing that middle portion of my motion, I suppose I can objectify. But as that happens, I'm transitioning between places. I'm not one place and I'm not in another place. So whiteness and warmth. Whiteness is a quality. It is something that we use to describe the thing that is white. And the same with warmth. We could use any number of different descriptors to identify something that is warm. We can give a description of a feeling. We can give more of an objective standard to warmth. But still, again, it's difficult to give an objective standard to warmth. The standard, I want to avoid the subject-object paradigm. But there is a degree of a variable standard within there somewhere. And again, convention comes in here in terms of warmth. So let's continue to hammer down what this might mean. And so we have a quality that is moving with a perception. A perception is something of an understanding or an integration of sense information. Perception can be seen as an integration of sense information. So now we have this integration that is coupled with the quality of that information. Now, we're talking about the genesis of the quality itself. And Socrates is saying, according to this theory of the Ionian school, that this genesis of the quality occurs when each of them, again, is moving together with the perception in the space between the active and passive factors. And so in our example, we have to figure out what the active factor is and passive factor is in a more concrete and relatable sense. We have described the active as the generative principle and the passive as the thing that is, the finite, the finitude. The passive factor becoming a percipient, or something that is capable of perceiving, but not a perception. And perhaps I should go further on the percipient as something or someone who actually perceives. They have the capability and possibly is perceiving, but they are not. The passive itself is not the perception. It is the mechanism that does the perception. And the active factor becomes such or such. Again, it's generative, so whatever it generates. But it is not a quality. And so, putting this all together, I imagine a hole, let's say a sphere, or a circle, let's say. Now the circle is split in half, and you have the arrows that indicate this sort of revolving nature to it. It's circulating in a particular direction. And this circulating, the word that comes to mind is becoming. Now imagine that there's a line drawn through the diameter of this circle. Now we've split it into two halves. One represents our active side and the other the passive side. Now what we have is a perception with a quality. And this is our active package as it moves in between this space, between our active principle and our passive principle. But together these things allow it affords it a bridge to jump to a new way of being, I guess you can call it. This new way of being is no longer the perception and the quality, but it is the percipient and the known thing. It is the understood version of the quality, we could say. That, when we were experiencing something that we might call warmth, now we have this idea and understanding, this sort of solidified box under which we can we can stamp and we could certify the quality as being this thing. It is our known through our experience. Because now, instead of the base perception, we are the percipient. It has become something of understanding, or something that is understood. Still doesn't save us from the relative trap, though. Not that Socrates is trying to do so, but now this is one interpretation. Maybe right or maybe wrong, but I think there are some key elements here that are pointing us in the right direction. One of them is that this is a relational thing. Socrates says it is by the association of the two with one another that they generate perceptions and the things perceived, and in so doing the active factor becomes such and such, which is this sort of, it seems like an irrelevant sort of remark, the such and such. It becomes something, but it doesn't really matter what it becomes. Or rather, perhaps it's the case that it just doesn't really need to be specified. While the passive factor becomes the percipient. Now the passive factor, when I think of percipient, I think of something that is more concrete. When I think of something that is the passive factor, I think of something that is just as it is. It's passive. It's perhaps it has its own motion to it, but it has a body. There's substance to it. There's some, maybe like a home base or a grounding to the more passive principle. Where again, the active is more the generative change type of principle. So once more, we have an operation under knowing after the divide is crossed. Whereas before the divide is crossed, before the perception and the whiteness and the warmth make the transition into the percipient and the such and such, or the concrete thing that is the whiteness or the quality of, now it is that thing. It is whiteness. It is white instead of whiteness. It's become that thing. And so this is an attempt to explain perception, and I think in a not in a directly explicit way, explain how one comes to know something. So Theodorus says, yes, remember that. I remember that, of course. Socrates says that we need not concern ourselves about other points in their doctrine, whether they mean what we say or something else. We must keep our eyes simply upon the object of our discussion. We must ask them this question. According to you, all things move and flow, isn't that so? Theodorus says yes. And they have both the motions that we distinguished, that is to say, they both move and alter. They move and they change. Theodorus says that must be so if they are to be wholly and completely in motion. Now Socrates says, now if they were only moving through space and not altering, we should presumably be able to say what the moving things flow, or how do we express it? Theodore says, that's all right. But since not even this abides, that what flows white, but rather it is in the process of change, so that there is flux of this very thing, also the whiteness, and it is passing over into another color, lest it be convicted of standing still in this respect. Since that is so, is it possible to give any name to a color which will properly be applied to it? Theodore says, I don't see how one could, Socrates, nor yet surely to anything else of that kind, if, being in flux, it is always quietly slipping away as you speak. And what about any particular kind of perception? For example, seeing or hearing, does it ever abide and remain seeing or hearing? It ought not to, certainly, if all things are in motion. Then we may not call anything seeing rather than not seeing, nor indeed may we call it any other perception rather than not, if it be admitted that all things are in motion in every way. Theodorus says, no, we may not. Socrates says, yet Theaetetus and I said that knowledge was perception. You did? And so our answer to the question, what is knowledge, gave something which is no more knowledge than not. Theodorus says, it seems as if it did. A fine way this turns out to be of making our answer right. We were most anxious to prove that all things are in motion, in order to make that answer come out correct. But what has really emerged is that if all things are in motion, every answer, on whatever subject, is equally correct. Both, it is thus, and it is not thus. Or if you like, becomes, as we don't want to use any expressions which will bring our friends to a standstill. Theodore says, you are quite right. Well, yes, Theodorus, except that I said thus, and not thus. One must not use even the word thus, for this thus would no longer be in motion, nor yet not thus, for here again there is no motion. The exponents of this theory need to establish some other language. As it is, they have no words that are consistent with their hypothesis, unless it would perhaps suit them best to use not at all thus, in a quite indefinite sense. So the image that I keep coming back to in my mind is the image of the snake that's eating its own tail. And when Socrates says that, but since not even this abides, that what flows white, but rather it is in the process of change, so that there is flux of this very thing, also the whiteness, and it is passing over into another color, lest it be convicted of standing still in this respect. So nothing can truly be, it's always in motion. And the image of the snake that's eating its own tail, you have the sort of the passive component, which is the tail, and then the generative component, which is this mouth that's sort of eating what was. So now what was never really was something, because it's in this constant state of creation and recycling. And I guess what exists momentarily, or it exists again in relationship to motion. The snake, everything is in relation to the head of the snake. It's this coming and going. It's a difficult thing to describe because it doesn't quite make sense to think about the world in this way. But Theodorus has a good point. He says, if being in flux, it is always quietly slipping away as you speak. It's something that you can't really grasp onto. You cannot hold it, you cannot retain it. The reality is this slippery thing. It's not for us to have. But that has some strong implications about truth, and about concreteness in general, about things that are known. And it really gets confusing when then Socrates says, we may not call anything seeing rather than not seeing. And that is because seeing or hearing never abides, it never agrees, it never remains, it's always in motion. So, again, the statement, we may not call anything seeing rather than not seeing, is a strange thing. Surely we must be able to identify between the two cases. Nor indeed may we call it any other perception rather than not. If it be admitted that all things are in motion in every way, and it appears to me as though they are doing their due diligence, perhaps trying to save a sinking ship, but all the while all their efforts do nothing more than to further exacerbate the rate at which it sinks. And the boat, of course, is an analogy to the theory put forth by Protagoras, and even elements of the conversation that Socrates had developed with Theaetetus, when he said that knowledge was perception. And so by this, Socrates comes to the conclusion, he says, and so our answers to the question, what is knowledge, gave something which is no more knowledge than not. So it gave us nothing. It gave us this snake that's eating its own tail. He says, but what has really emerged is that if all things are in motion, every answer on whatever subject is equally correct. Both it is thus and it is not thus. Or if you like, becomes. So getting back to their dialogue here, Theodorus responds to Socrates about this use of language, and he says that would at least be an idiom most appropriate to them. Socrates continues, he says, then we are set free from your friend, Theodorus. We do not need to concede to him that every man is the measure of all things. If he be not a man of understanding. And we are not going to grant that knowledge is perception, not at any rate on the line of inquiry which supposes that all things are in motion. We are not going to grant it unless Theaetetus here has some other way of stating it. Now Theodorus says, that's very good hearing, Socrates. For when these matters were concluded, I was to be set free from my task of answering you, according to our agreement, which specified the end of the discussion of Protagoras' theory. Theaetetus says, oh no, indeed, Theodorus, not till you and Socrates have done what you proposed just now, and dealt with the other side, the people who say that the universe stands still. Theodorus says, what's this, Theaetetus? You at your age teaching your elders to be unjust and breaking their agreements? What you have got to do is to prepare and render account to Socrates yourself for the rest of this discussion. Theaetetus says, all right, if he likes, but I would rather have listened to a discussion of these views. Theodorus says, well, challenging Socrates to an argument is like inviting cavalry into the plain. So ask your questions, and you shall hear. And Socrates says, but I don't think, Theodorus, that I'm going to be persuaded by Theaetetus to do what he demands. But what is it makes you unwilling? Socrates says, shame. I'm afraid our criticism might be a very cheap affair, and if I feel like this before the many who have made the universe one and unmoved, Melesius, and the rest of them, I feel it still more in the face of the one, Parmenides. Parmenides seems to me, in the words of Homer, to be reverend and awful. I met him when I was very young, and he was a very old man, and he seemed to me to have a wholly noble depth, so I am afraid we might not understand even what he says. Still less should we maintain to his real thought. Above all, I am afraid that the very object of our discussion, the nature of knowledge, might be left unexamined amid the crowd of theories that will rush in upon us if we admit them, especially as the theory we have now brought up is one which involves unimaginably vast issues. To treat it as a sideshow would be insult and injury. Well, if it is adequately discussed, it is likely to spread out until it completely eclipses the problems of knowledge. We must not do either. What we must do is make use of our midwife's art to deliver Theaetetus of the thoughts which he has convinced about the nature of knowledge. Now there's a footnote here for an alternative translation. The quote begins, "What we must do is make use of our midwife's art and set Theaetetus free from the thoughts which he has conceived about the nature of knowledge." Theodore says, "Well, if that's what you think proper, it must be done. Now, Theaetetus, I want you to think about one point in what has been said. Your answer was that knowledge is perception, wasn't it?" Theaetetus says, "Yes." Now, supposing you were asked, with what does a man see, white and black things, and with what does he hear, high and low notes? You would reply, I imagine, with his eyes and ears. Theaetetus says, "I should, yes." Now, as a rule, it is no sign of ill breeding to be easy in the use of language and take no particular care in one's choice of words. It is rather the opposite that gives a man away. But such exactness is sometimes necessary, and it is necessary here. For example, to fasten upon something in your answer that is not correct. Think now, is it more correct to say that the eyes are that with which we see, or that through which we see? Do we hear with the ears or through the ears? Theaetetus says, "Well, I should think, Socrates, that it is through which we perceive in each case, rather than with which." Socrates says, "Yes, my son. It would be a very strange thing, I must say, if there were a number of perceptions sitting inside of us, as if we were wooden horses, and there were not some single form, soul, or whatever one ought to call it, to which all these converge, something with which, through those things, as if they were instruments, we perceive all that is perceptible." Theaetetus says, "That sounds to me better than the other way of putting it." Socrates continues, "Now the reason why I am being so precise with you is this. I want to know if it is with one and the same part of ourselves that we reach, through our eyes, to white and black things, and through the other means to yet further things, and whether, if asked, you will be able to refer all these to the body. But perhaps it would be better if you started the answers yourself, rather than that I should busy myself on your behalf. Tell me, the instruments through which you perceive hot, hard, light, sweet things, do you consider that they all belong to the body, or can they be referred elsewhere?" Theaetetus says, "No, they all belong to the body." "And are you also willing to admit that what you perceive through one power, you can't perceive through another? For instance, what you perceive through hearing, you couldn't perceive through sight, and similarly, what you perceive through sight, you couldn't perceive through hearing." Theaetetus says, I could hardly refuse to grant that. Then suppose you think something about both. You can't possibly be having a perception about both, either through one of these instruments or through the other. Theaetetus says no. Now take a sound and a color. First of all, don't you think this same thing about both of them? Namely, that they both are? Theaetetus says I do. Also that each of them is indifferent from the other, and the same as itself. Theaetetus says of course. And that both together are two, and each of them is one? Theaetetus says yes, I think that too. So let's go back through this page and interpret what we have read so far. I think I have a rather bad habit of reading a few paragraphs and then coming back to something at the top of the page to reinterpret and reorient. I think the practice of reorientation is fundamental to understanding reading, what one is reading, and in particular philosophy. But I think at times it could be a bit disorienting due to how far back I may go. So I'll try and work on something that is a little more localized to the paragraph that I'm reading. However, that being said, sometimes it is necessary to read quite a bit before one goes back to readjust, because not every paragraph or not every sentence is going to be worthy of some sort of translation or thought. Some things are just more readily digestible than others. So that being said, let's reflect on what Socrates said at the beginning of this page. He says, think now, is it more correct to say that the eyes are that with which we see, or that through which we see? Do we hear with the ears or through the ears? So as with many things that are fundamental, that can be taken for granted. When I read what's in italics here, the word with and the word through, it takes me a minute to think about exactly what it would mean for someone to say that someone uses the eyes sort of with their desire to see, I guess. Or in Plato's words here, is it more correct to say that the eyes are that with which we see? And I find myself thinking, well, with, this is a common word, surely I know what this means. With means to be accompanied by, or in the company of. And so, if it were to be the case that we were to see with our eyes would be sort of an act of So I decided to keep that piece of audio in there just because to demonstrate how annoying people can be. I live on a busy street and the window is open. Anyway, I was talking about what exactly would it mean for to see with the eyes, or to see or to hear with the ears. And if we are to say to see with, that implies that the eyes are sort of this, not necessarily it is a participant in the case of the with, but it is a separate entity, that almost like a friend that we are inviting to enjoy this experience of seeing. But it is more correct, obviously, to say that we see through the eyes. And by saying, we can imagine that there is some information, it comes in, it meets the apparatus that is the eye, the thing that allows us to gather the information from the environment and then to perceive it. So we see through it, quite literally. And the same as with the ears. Now, Socrates does say, I must say, that there were a number of perceptions sitting inside of us, as if we were a wooden horse. And there were not some single form, soul, or whatever one ought to call it, to which all these converge, something with which, through those things, as if they were instruments, we perceive all that is perceptible. Now I would like to point out a couple different things from this statement. The first of which, when Socrates says, and there were not some single form, soul, or whatever ought to call it, to which these converge. First and foremost, I enjoy the casual nature of that statement. But also, the nature of the statement is interesting. That is, the characterization of the soul as something that is the integrator, that is the unifier of the things that are perceived, of the organs through which we are able to perceive of our reality. And so at the top of the hill, this soul sits, picking and choosing different things. It is the master of the kingdom that is the individual. And I find it interesting to reflect on all of the potential subjects of this kingdom, for which the soul is the king, let's say. There are many different senses, there are many different perceptions, there are many different needs and wants. Some very sophisticated things. No doubt there are things that are tempting to the soul. And the complexity of this temptation is well beyond individual base perceptions. Or perhaps I should say that it can be. Just as an individual sensation may be the cause of our repeated behavior, it can also be an affliction of the soul that tempts one to engage in base desire, to satisfy or to numb, to nullify, to medicate against a particular truth that's difficult to bear. And so again, we were talking about this kingdom that is the individual. What's interesting, we've been talking a lot about the base perceptions, the individual sensations that we might experience. There's a lot of analogy here in this dialogue to that. But I think the true magic, the interesting thing about man, is the intermediate level. If we are to view this as a true hierarchy, at the top being this soul, with a bunch of sort of intermediate layers or levels, at the bottom you might have individual sensations like temperature, touch, vibration, all the above. But then you have varying degrees of integration. And at the top, how exactly the individual, and I've talked at length about the difference between, or how the soul can differ from the individual. But just for simplicity's sake, again, thinking about the soul as king, the way in which the soul integrates the intermediate layers towards something that is actionable, towards something that is long-term, it is rational, it is sophisticated. That's a fascinating thing. Socrates says, "Now the reason why I'm being so precise with you is this. I want to know if it is with one and the same part of ourselves that we reach through our eyes to white and black things, and through the other means to yet further things." So what I find interesting here is the use of the word reach. Again, he says, I want to know if it is with one and the same part of ourselves that we reach. So just focusing on the word reach there. Before, when we were talking about the with and the through, in terms of sight and hearing, we were talking about the reception. We were talking about the sort of catcher that catches the ball as the information comes in through the eye. But now we're talking about reach. Now we're talking about direction. And this is the soul, again, in his question. He says he wants to know if it is with one and the same part of ourselves that we reach. So I'm guessing he means, is it one and the same part of ourselves that is the grand integrator at the top, the soul, that receives all of this information, and also the same thing that directs the thing that perceives, directs the thing that sees, directs the eyes, and certainly it is. We can just as much be directive conscious agents to direct our eyes for something, some purposeful cause, or we can be passive recipients. We can take the sensation of sight at leisure, as perhaps we are walking down the sidewalk. There's not too much that we have to pay attention to. We may be lost in our thoughts, and yet we are passively consuming the information from the environment. And if something does come up that draws our attention, perhaps something that's dangerous or something that's generally interesting, then we direct our organs that give us the information for the environment, because it is necessary for our goals and our desires. Now, the other interesting thing about this is, and through the other means to yet further things. So I think this is parallel to what we were discussing before. It is the intermediate layer. It is the thing that is beyond the individual senses. There seems to be implied this continuation, and through the other means to yet further things. So there is a distinction between the organ of senses, the eye, and then the other means, or the other manner, the other way, the other method, the other process, which would seem to suggest the part of ourselves that begins to integrate the senses. It is a level beyond the individual sense information. If we are to take the eye and the way that it sees, this is one basic level of information. I'm looking in front of me into a cubby. In this cubby there's a few different things. There's a couple checks, there's a couple pens, there's a couple coins. But before I explicitly stated all of these things, I really wasn't paying attention to anything that was in there. I was more focused on what I was saying. Now, of course, certainly I can see what is here, and if there was some substantial change in its condition, as if a mouse were inside of there and suddenly made itself known to me, the direction of this kingdom, let's say, to keep it consistent with the previous example, would be concerned about the mouse, and my train of thought would probably be interrupted. And Socrates says, and whether, if asked, you will be able to refer all these things to the body. So it's possible that the direction we are going here, or the question that we are asking, is it the case that all of these things, all of these senses, and even the higher, the level above the basic senses, the integration that we were talking about, all the way up until the level of the king, the soul, let's say, the prime director of this individual machine, can we refer all of this to the fundamental elements, to the body? Or in other words, is this primarily emergent? That is, more complex phenomena are produced by its simpler elements. Socrates says, tell me, the instruments through which you perceive hot, hard, light, sweet things, do you consider that they all belong to the body, or can they be referred elsewhere? Now Theaetetus responds, no, they all belong to the body. And are you also willing to admit that what you perceive through one power, you can't perceive through another? So what does it mean through one power? Now let's remember what some of the synonyms are for power here. Ability, capacity, capability, potential, faculty. So we could think about this as being, so the one power being like the eyes, or something probably lesser known to them, like a particular nerve ending that carries specific information to the brain. Just for the sake of wholeness here, I'll touch for a moment on this nerve ending just to give us an idea of how many different powers, we can say, are wound up just with that mode of information transfer. We have mechanoreceptors, nerve endings responsible for sending mechanical stimuli like touch, pressure, vibration, stretching. Now, among the mechanical receptors, there are subdivisions of that, which I won't go into. We have nociceptors. These detect and transmit pain signals in response to noxious stimuli, like heat, cold, pressure, tissue damage. These are, of course, the things that play a role in the perception of pain. Now, the information itself is not pain. It is more of an integrated thing. It's an output pain. We have thermoreceptors, which detect changes in temperature. We have chemoreceptors, responsible for detecting chemical changes in the environment, like the concentrations of various substances. We have proprioceptors, which allows us to perceive of where our limbs are in space. Information about position, movement, and tension. We have photoreceptors, specialized nerve endings found in the retina, responsible for detecting light and initiating visual signals. And so we can see that how many different powers, right, in the language of Socrates that there are, and of course this is not exhaustive. So again, he says, and are you also willing to admit that what you perceive through one power, you can't perceive through another? For instance, what you perceive through hearing, you couldn't perceive through sight. And similarly, what you perceive through sight, you couldn't perceive through hearing. Theaetetus says, I could hardly refuse to grant that. Socrates says, then suppose you think something about both. You can't possibly be having a perception about both, either through one of these instruments or through the other. Theaetetus says no. Now take a sound and a color. First of all, don't you think the same thing about both of them, namely, that they both are? Theaetetus says I do. Also, that each of them is different from the other, and the same as itself. Theaetetus says of course. And that both together are two, and each of them is one. Yes, I think that too. Are you also able to consider whether they are like or unlike each other? Yes, I may be. Now what is it through which you think all these things about them? It is not possible, you see, to grasp what is common to both either through sight or through hearing. Let us consider another thing which will show the truth of what we are saying. Suppose it were possible to inquire whether both are salty or not. You can tell me, of course, with what you would examine them. It would clearly be neither sight nor hearing, but something else. Yes, of course, the power which functions through the tongue. So here we are seeing a combination of a few things. We have the recognition that the organs that take up particular pieces of information are individual to themselves. And that an organ that, if we wanted to perceive something with an organ, let's say the eye, it is impossible to have both sight and hearing flow through that organ. Now, of the things that are to be perceived, something like a color or something of a sound, both of these things have their own independent existences. We can differentiate between the two. We can recognize their difference, both in terms of their quality and in terms of their absolute difference, in terms of the sense difference. One is seen by the eye or through the eye, and one is heard through the ears. Now, what Socrates is getting at is, well, since you can see through the eyes, hear through the ears, what organ is it that you can differentiate and organize these things through? Now, we've already come to that conclusion. We've talked of the soul in an earlier paragraph. The soul, similar to an organ, but not the same as an organ, is this sort of amalgam. We can call it an amalgam of perhaps a bundle of nerves together. And there is this unification among all these different sectors and processing centers that allows for some identity, that allows for unified action, it allows for something that is able to appropriately assign senses to their appropriate place, and it allows us to perform actions according to the result of our sensory perception. Much like the eye, an organ that has its receptive qualities but also can be directed through the higher centers, the soul also has its receptive quality, receiving information from the external world through sense organs. It gives direction, and it has this quality of integration and differentiation. And Socrates continues, he says, good. Now through what does that power function, which reveals to you what is common in the case both of all things and of these two? I mean that which you express by the word is, and is not, and other terms used in our question about them just now. What kind of instruments will you assign for all these? Through what does that which is percipient in us perceive all of them? Theaetetus says, you mean being and not being, likeness and unlikeness, same and different, also one and any other number applied to them. And obviously, too, your question is about odd and even, and all that is involved with these attributes. And you want to know through what bodily instruments we perceive all these with the soul. Socrates says, you follow me exceedingly well, Theaetetus. These are just the things I am asking about. Theaetetus says, but I couldn't possibly say. All I can tell you is that it doesn't seem to me that for these things there's any special instrument at all, as there is for the others. It seems to me that in investigating the common features of everything, the soul functions through itself. And Socrates says, yes, Theaetetus. You would say that, because you are handsome and not ugly, as Theodorus would have it. For handsome is as handsome says, and besides being handsome, you have done me a good turn, and have saved me a vast amount of talk, if it seems to you that, while the soul considers some things through the bodily powers, there are others which it considers alone and through itself. This is what I thought myself, but I wanted you to think it too. And so here we have an idea of the soul. Again, part of this thing is what receives the information from the environment. But we have to remember the distinction here. You have saved me a vast amount of talk, if it seems to you that while the soul considers some things through the bodily powers, there are others which it considers alone and through itself. That's the main point. And so of those things which the soul considers through the bodily powers or the bodily capacities or abilities, the others which it considers alone and through itself. Now, of these others that it considers through itself, there's a separation there between the sensory information from the environment and then something through itself. Now, exactly what it would mean for this something else to be through the soul, it's difficult to say, especially in absence of the sensory information. Because we'd have to imagine that a degree of sensory information is necessary to allow the individual to understand something of the environment. To exist in a pure asensate environment would not be the type of mind that would be produced in such an environment would not be the one that I think most of us would recognize. There would be many developmental delays. Much of our convention and education is wrapped up in a degree of orientation, whether we like it or not. This is also formed by our interactions with one another, with our families and so forth, and our cultural traditions. This all develops the soul, but again, in the total absence of all sensory information. we would have a very difficult time seeing the mind work. And I think that just as a spark is required to ignite the engine, but once it's on, it could sort of feed off of the fuel in the engine. I think it's similar to the mind. It has to require some sort of foundational material, but once it's going, once it's given that spark, it can go, and it can consider things alone and through itself. Now Theaetetus says, well, it does seem to me to be so. Socrates says, now in which class do you put being? For that, above all, is something that accompanies everything. I should put it among the things which the soul itself reaches out after by itself. Also like and unlike, same and different. Theaetetus says yes. Socrates says, what about the beautiful and ugly, good and bad? Theaetetus says, yes, these too, and these, above all, I think the soul examines their being in comparison with one another. Here it seems to be making a calculation within itself of past and present in relation to future. Socrates says, not so fast now. Wouldn't you say that it is through touch that the soul perceives the hardness of what is hard, and similarly the softness of what is soft? Theaetetus says yes. But as regards their being, the fact that they are, their opposition to one another, and the being, again, of this opposition, the matter is different. Here the soul itself attempts to reach a decision for us by rising to compare them with one another. In other words, the information that we are provided by our bodily senses are limited by their ability, or limited by their power, as Socrates might put it. And from this limitation, we do not have the comparison between the two types of objects that we're discussing here. But the conclusion, the reaching for a decision, is by the integration of the senses into something that is more than the base level information. It exists as its own entity. However we may describe that its own being, it's not really the point. But the point is that that thing exists, and it exists as such, so as to allow, again, the integration of different senses. Another way to say integrating, we could say unifying, or providing meaning or purpose to something to make a distinction between. So from the multiplicity, we have unity, and from this unity we have directed decision-making, purposeful decision-making, to give sense, to give reality, perhaps not reality, it's reality to the individual soul, to the individual mind, so that it can appropriately mirror what it sees in front of it. It is the sense-making apparatus for the physical world, I guess we could say. But even our representation of the physical world is limited by our sense-making abilities. This is something that we talked about in length before. There are many things within what we should call the reality that is external to us, that we cannot perceive of. And there are many things that we can perceive of that are filtered because they are not relevant. And so we have two layers here. We have a matter of relevance, and we have the bottom substrate at what the body can actually perceive in its environment. Now Socrates says, and thus there are some things which all creatures, men and animals alike, are naturally able to perceive as soon as they are born. I mean, the experiences which reach the soul through the body, but calculations regarding their being and their advantageousness come, when they do, only as a result of a long and arduous development, involving a good deal of trouble and education. Now the first part of this is fairly obvious. That is to say, there's a certain level of experience when we are born that is just sort of naturally ingrained in us. That is to say, if we had no other influences, that at the very minimal, we would be beings of the sort that have that experience by virtue or through the physical nature of the human being or of the animal, which would include, again, all the various organs, all the various sense organs, all the nerve endings. But the more sophisticated, if we move it up a level, and we start thinking about education, we start thinking about difficult decision-making, more complex decision-making. These sorts of things, Socrates says, at this level, it involves calculations regarding their being. Now this is a key statement, and it's not readily accessible without giving it some thought. So in terms of calculation, we can think of something that is computational. We could think of something that is a judgment, a projection, a forecast, a prediction, an assessment. But let's just say that we can say, but a judgment regarding their being and their advantageousness, that's another thing. What about this advantageousness? What about its favorability are we talking about? Well, we have to remember that we are talking about the being itself, and the things that favor it, the things that we must do to judge it. These sorts of things develop over long periods, difficult periods of development. Again, as he says, it involves a good deal of trouble and education. Theaetetus says, yes, that is certainly so. Now, is it possible for someone who does not even get at being to get at truth? Theaetetus says, no, it's impossible. So the statement, now is it possible for someone who does not even get at being to get at truth, seems an awkward sentence to me. But I think the main idea here is, the question is asking, is it possible for someone that doesn't understand being to know what truth is? And now Theaetetus says, no, it's not possible. So, as a result, we have to understand what this being is, what it means for something to be. And Socrates says, and if a man fails to get at the truth of a thing, will he ever be a person who knows that thing? I don't see how, Socrates. The knowledge is found not in the experiences, but in the process of reasoning about them. It is here, seemingly, not in the experiences, that it is possible to grasp being and truth. So it appears. Then in the face of such differences, would you call both by the same name? Now, just as we are discussing the matter of integration, as the basic information of the senses are integrated into a more unified whole that then makes executive decisions, the knowledge that of experience is similar in this case. Now, experience is something that's at another level than just base senses, because there are many senses that are involved here, many different types of information that are being wound up. Even context, I think, at that level exists here. There can be feelings that exist at this level, right? Experiences can be anything from sharing a meal with someone that you care about, to waking up in the morning, to stubbing your toe on the corner of a door. There are plenty of different types of experiences, and many different experiences exist at different levels of complexity. But in this statement, it is the case that all experiences occur, but it is within the reasoning about these experiences that one can grasp the truth. Now, that's not to say that experiences themselves are not truthful, because obviously they are. But that, similar to unpacking a present, it unveils something that you did not know when you were in the process or in the experience. And this sort of unveiling of what is beneath and this reasoning is knowledge. So Socrates says, then in the face of such differences, would you call both by the same name? Now, I'm assuming that he means in the face of such differences between our senses and that experiential level. And the higher level integration that makes sense of what has occurred in the moment during the experience. Theaetetus says one would certainly have no right to. Now, what name do you give the former? Seeing, hearing, smelling, feeling, cold or warm. Theaetetus says, I call that perceiving. What else can I call it? So the whole lot taken together you call perception. Theaetetus says, necessarily, which, we say, has no share in the grasping of truth, since it has none in the grasping of being. Theaetetus says, no, it has none. So it has no share in knowledge either. No. Then, Theaetetus, perception and knowledge can never be the same thing. So from what I understand, we are forming a picture. That's a rather dissatisfying picture for anybody who places a large stock within their own perceptions, and perhaps in their own experiences. But what can be said of where we are right now? Now, there are a few different paths, a few different directions that I can go. A lot of this reminds me of Christian symbolism, heaven and earth. But this matter of being so fundamental to knowledge, in something that seemingly transcends that of our senses, that of our perceptions, then what exactly do we do to identify the pattern? If we are limited by our physical reality, and when I say our physical reality, I mean our hardware that allows us to see the physical world. Perhaps even our conception of the physical world itself, I'm not too sure. But at the very least, we can begin to talk about the lens and our perceptions. Again, we've discussed the limitations therein and the broader physical world that is beyond a lot of our perceptions. But it is not within the absence of sense information that prevents us from knowing. Because as we've just discussed, perception is not knowledge. So it is not a matter, again, of the amount of information or the type of information. Not to say that it's irrelevant, because reflection on that type of information would be relevant. And I can see that this hypothesis is colliding in all sorts of ways with our beginning dialogue when we were talking about Protagoras. We were talking about the active infinite multitude and the passive infinite multitude. Then when we were talking about man being the measure of all things, that what is true for him, what is true for another man is true for that man. We've gotten rid of it. We said that, well, no, true is its own thing. It's independent of man's perceptions. Now, Plato, as we know, characterizes things into forms. And these forms are the things that provide the sort of spiritual archetype for that which is, or the being of something. And for one to grasp that form means that one has that intellectual insight and understanding, knowledge. It is in some sense finding the heavenly principle in anything that we may perceive or experience to be changing in our lives. It is the fundamental constant. It is something of a pillar. A pillar is a symbol that is commonly used in Christian writings as a place of stability, a place that is the center of things, that holds things up. It's within this pattern of being that we turn to for safety and for security, because we know it to be true, because we know that it can transcend some of the most difficult circumstances, that it has been held up against vigorous testing. Now, the scientific method has provided us with some of this, but it does run into problems, again, with the perceptual realm. That is, the standard that is used as the measure is the thing that then we perceive, and so we have to be careful there. But within the forms and the principles that we find, I think we have to recognize their role in shaping the world of appearances. Let's continue. Socrates says, "But our object in beginning this discussion was not to find out what knowledge is not, but to find out what it is. However, we have made a little progress. We shall not now look for knowledge in sense perception at all, but in whatever we call that activity of the soul when it is busy by itself about the things which are." Theaetetus says, "Well, the name, Socrates, I suppose, is judgment. Your opinion, my dear lad, is correct. Now look back to the beginning, wipe out all that we have said hitherto, and see if you can see any better from where you have now progressed to. Tell me again, what is knowledge? Well, Socrates, one can't say that it is judgment in general, because there is no false judgment. But true judgment may well be knowledge. So let that be my answer. If the same thing happens again, and we find as we go on that it turns out not to be so, we'll try something else. And even so, Theaetetus, you have answered me in the way one ought, with a good will, and not reluctantly, as you did at first. If we continue like this, one of two things will happen. Either we shall find what we are going out after, or we shall be less inclined to think we know things which we don't know at all. And even that would be a reward we could not fairly be dissatisfied with. Now what is this that you say? There are two forms of judgment, true and false, and your definition is that true judgment is knowledge. Yes, that is how it looks to me now. Now I wonder if it's worthwhile, at this stage, to go back to an old point about judgment. What point do you mean? I have something in my mind which has often bothered me before, and got me into great difficulty, both with my own thought and in discussion with other people. I mean, I can't say what it is, this experience we have, and how it arises in us. What experience? Judging what is false. Even now, you know, I'm still considering. I'm in two minds, whether to let it go, or whether to look into it in a different manner from a short while ago. Why not, Socrates? If this appears for any reason to be the right thing to do? As you and Theodorus were saying just now, and quite rightly, when you were talking about leisure, we are not pressed for time in talk of this kind. A very proper reminder. Perhaps it would not be a bad moment to go back upon our tracks. It is better to accomplish a little well than a great deal unsatisfactorily. Now how are we to proceed? And actually, what is it that we are saying? We claim, don't we, that false judgment repeatedly occurs, and one of us judges falsely, the other truly, as if it was in the nature of things for this to happen. Theaetetus says, that is what we claim. Now isn't it true about all things, together or individually, that we must either know them or not know them? I am ignoring for the moment the intermediate conditions of learning and forgetting, as they don't affect the argument here. Of course, Socrates. In that case there is no alternative. With each thing, we either know it or we do not. Then when a man judges, the objects of his judgment are necessarily either things which he knows or things which he doesn't know? Yes, that must be so. Yet if he knows a thing, it is impossible that he should not know it. Or, if he does not know it, he cannot know it. Yes, of course. Now take the man who judges what is false. Is he thinking that things which he knows are not these things, but some other things which he knows, so that knowing both, he is ignorant of both? But that would be impossible, Socrates. Then is he imagining that things which he doesn't know are other things which he doesn't know? Is it possible that a man who knows neither Theaetetus nor Socrates should take it into his head that Socrates was Theaetetus or Theaetetus is Socrates. I don't see how that could happen. But a man certainly doesn't think that things he knows are things he does not know, or again, that things he doesn't know are things he knows. No, that would be a very odd thing. Then in what way is false judgment still possible? There is evidently no possibility of judgment outside the cases we have mentioned, since everything is either a thing we know or a thing we don't know. And within these limits, there appears to be no place for false judgment to be possible. That's perfectly true. Then perhaps we better take up a different line of inquiry. Perhaps we should proceed not by way of knowing and not knowing, but by way of being and not being. So this is a rather confusing set of statements here. So let's try to reorient and put them in a new set of words. Look at it through a new lens. So we have two things. We have the known and not known. We are in our hypothetical world here. When Socrates says, now isn't it true about all things, together or individually, that we must either know them or not know them? And in the first statement we have, when a man judges, the objects of his judgment are necessarily either things which he knows or things which he doesn't know. So the first step is to figure out what it means to make a judgment. To make a judgment is to form an opinion. Form an opinion or a conclusion, to determine, to decide. Then the next step is, if he knows something, it is impossible that he should not know it. Or if he does not know it, he cannot know it. So we have two things. We have the known and we have the not known. And these are correlated to some object of attention. Think about to know what something is, like a quarter, and then to see something in your environment which you are unsure of what it is. You do not know what it is. These are our two different states. Now, imagine a man who judges that something is false. Socrates asks, is he thinking that things which he knows are not these things, but some other things which he knows? Now this is where I get spun off the wagon. Because to know the object that is false is to know untruth. It is to know this incorrectness. Now, to make a decision about what is incorrect, we can start from what is known. And I think this is where Socrates is. Again, is he thinking that things which he knows are not these things, but some other things which he knows? So that knowing both, he is ignorant of both. So it begins by knowing that something is false. And I think that that's where it starts for me, the confusion. It's the knowing the incorrectness and then the hypothetical that Socrates gives. Now, it is absurd to think that way. I think that's sort of the point here, because squaring the circle is almost impossible. It just doesn't make any sense. And Theaetetus says, rightly so, but that would be impossible, Socrates. He continues, then is he imagining that things which he doesn't know are other things which he doesn't know? Is it possible that a man who knows neither Theaetetus nor Socrates would take it into his head that Socrates is Theaetetus, or Theaetetus is Socrates? And again, this doesn't really make any sense either. If I don't know something, I'm not going to readily attribute something that is not known. There's no relevance there. There's no reason for me to do so. And the statement, but a man certainly doesn't think that things he knows are things he doesn't know, or again, that things he doesn't know are things he knows. Again, an odd sort of thing. The question is false judgment and to judge what is false the same thing? Now, under this framework, it's possible there's something I don't understand, but it seems to me that there is a difference between a man that judges what is false because of something that is known, a statement perhaps, that's attributed to something that he knows, and the statement he would consider false. And then, on the other hand, false judgment is something that perfectly would not make sense under the framework that we are given here of the known and not known. Because to make a false judgment is to decide on something as being untrue when it is actually true. But that would mean that one would make the decision of a position of knowing when they actually do not know. And in this sort of hard and fast, again, the narrow framework from which we were given, it's impossible. Socrates continues, then perhaps we had better take up a different line of inquiry. Perhaps we should proceed not by way of knowing and not knowing, but by way of being and not being. Theaetetus says, how do you mean? Perhaps the simple fact is this. It is when a man judges about anything, things which are not, that he is inevitably judging falsely, no matter what may be the nature of his thought in other respects. So regardless of the individual opinion of his, if he judges falsely, even if he believes that he is correct, the judgment based on the reality of what is, again, this is sort of the realm of being, is and is not. By the very fact of what is, he can be considered wrong. That again is very plausible, Socrates. Socrates says, now how will that be? What are we going to say, Theaetetus, if somebody sets about examining us, and we are asked, is what these words express possible for anyone? Can a man judge what is not, either about one of these things which are, or just by itself? I suppose we shall reply, yes, when he is thinking, but thinking what is not true. Or how shall we answer? So the previous statement, it is when a man judges about anything, things which are not, that he inevitably judges falsely, no matter what may be the nature of his thought in other respects. So what can we say of this? So again, this judgment, this conclusion or decision that we come to about something, I think we should consider specifically the term, the things which are not. The things which are not. It's easy to imagine the things that are. There are many things in the world that I can claim that are, many of them in front of me that I can see. But of the things which are not, it's difficult to describe because they don't have a place in being or existence, perhaps. And so to make a decision about something that has no being or no existence, the claim here is that he is inevitably judging falsely. Now it's likely because of the thing not existing. Having no place in anything that is graspable or tangible. There's nothing for which the judgment can rest on. But when Theaetetus says, that again is very plausible, Socrates says, now how will that be? Now, like with most things that Socrates says, it's useful to go through the thought exercise to determine if the path that we are on is the correct path, or if we should course correct and ask a new question. But in the case of this not being and the judgment, I would have to imagine that if one was to judge that something is not, I would have to wonder about the truthfulness of that statement, because I would want to say that you can have a truthful statement to make a judgment about something which is not, some hypothetical. What are we going to say? Theaetetus, if somebody sets out examining us, and we are asked, is what these words express possible for anyone? Can a man judge what is not, either about one of these things which are, or just by itself? I suppose we shall reply, yes, when he is thinking, but thinking is not true, or how shall we answer? Now this line I think is similar to the conclusion that we came to, namely that the judgment exists within the hypothetical realm. We are trying to produce something which is not, to begin with. Now Theaetetus says in response, that's our answer, just sort of going along with what Socrates is suggesting. Socrates continues, he says, now does this kind of thing happen elsewhere? What kind of thing? Well, for instance, that a man sees something, yet sees nothing. How could he? On the contrary, in fact, if he is seeing any one thing, he must be seeing a thing which is. Or do you think that a one in quotes, can be found among the things which are not? Theaetetus says, I certainly don't. Now this is fairly straightforward here. If a man has an object of his sight, it is not a false object because he can see it. Now of course there are examples of hallucination where this is not true. Some person may be seeing something that is not actually there, but perceiving that it is. Now Theaetetus says that to the point of the one being found among the things that are not. Theaetetus says he doesn't see how that would be possible. Socrates says, then a man who is seeing any one thing is seeing something which is. Theaetetus says, apparently. It also follows that a man who is hearing anything is hearing some one thing, and something which is. Yes. And a man who is touching anything is touching some one thing, and a thing which is, if it is one. Yes, that also follows. And a man who is judging some one thing, is he not? Necessarily. And a man who is judging some one thing is judging something which is. Theaetetus grants that. Then that means that a man who is judging something which is not is judging nothing. So it appears. But a man who is judging nothing is not judging at all. That seems clear. So what can we say about that statement? But a man who is judging nothing is not judging at all. What does it mean to judge nothing? What does nothing mean? If we are to break down nothing into its component parts, we have no thingness, we have a no thing. Now a thing is something that is, in some sense, it's tangible, it is identifiable, it is graspable. A thing, in my mind at least, it's usually an object, a physical object. It could be a person, could be a thing, a water bottle could be a thing, a table can be a thing. But the absence of that thing, now I could say that as a matter of language, I can ask, is my water bottle on the table? And perhaps it's not on the table that I'm asking, perhaps it's in some other location. The other person can reply by saying, no, there is nothing. And in a way that's true, because there is no thing of a particular characteristic on the table. But that nothing, and that judgment about the nothingness that is on the table, is not a judgment about, is not a judgment that doesn't exist, because it is grounded in reality to an object that actually exists. So perhaps this can't exactly be what we're talking about. We're talking about the absolute nothing, and the identification of the object and the nothing. You can have an object that precedes nothingness, like our previous example, but you can't have an object from nothingness. Perhaps we can say it that way. Again, the statement, then that means that a man who is judging something is judging nothing. And we've identified that when we have information that confirms the existence of a thing, it becomes a thing. Again, barring all of the externalities about false perception. Socrates continues, he says, but a man who is judging nothing is not judging at all. And so, it is not possible to judge what is not, either about the things which are or by itself. False judgment, then, is something different from judging things which are not. Theaetetus says, it looks as if it were. Socrates says, that neither on this approach nor on the one we followed just now does false judgment exist in us. So what exactly does that mean? And Socrates says, and so it is not possible to judge what is not, either about the things which are or just by itself. Now we're getting into the fundamentals here. We're not talking about sloppiness of language. We've already discussed what it would mean to judge about something that is not, again with this lack of graspability, lack of anything to place our feet on. There is nothing that is relative to nothingness. Now, when we judge an object that is, certainly we can make statements about what the object is not. But again, this is because the object has become before nothingness. So it seems as though the object provides the intelligibility that allows us to perceive nothingness. Then, is it in this way that the things we call by that name arises? Theaetetus says how? We say that there is false judgment, a kind of other judging, when a man, in place of one of the things that are, has substituted in his thought another of the things that are and asserts that it is. In this way, he is always judging something which is, but judges one thing in place of another, and having missed the thing which was the object of his consideration, he might fairly be called one who judges falsely. So we can imagine a thing that is, has its own home, has its own base in reality. Now it's no surprise to anyone, it's probably straightforward, that if we are to make a false judgment, we are to, again, not start from nothingness, but to proceed from thingness. Our error and our mistake comes from choosing the incorrect thing to begin our judgment or our assertion. That's where mistakes can be had, because there's a mismatch between our judgment and reality. Now Theaetetus says, now you seem to me to have got it quite right. When a man judges ugly instead of beautiful, or beautiful instead of ugly, then he is truly judging what is false. Socrates says, evidently, Theaetetus, you have not much opinion of me. You don't find me at all alarming. What in particular makes you say that? Well, I suppose you don't think me capable of taking up your truly false, and asking you whether it is possible that a thing should be slowly swift or heavily light, or whether anything else can possibly occur in a way not in accordance with its own nature, but in accordance with that of its opposite and contrary to itself. But let that pass. I don't want your boldness to go unrewarded. You like the suggestion, you say, that false judgment is other judging. Theaetetus says, yes, I do. Now, it's a funny critique by Socrates, because he does have a point. Truly false is sort of it's an antagonism. It's a oxymoronic. But, to Theaetetus' point, when he says that one is truly judging what is false, it's sort of a layered cake of a statement, because the man's behavior is true insofar as he is judging falsely, but his action and the truthfulness of his thought and his judgment is false. And so it gets lost in language a bit, and I think Socrates is a bit cheeky to point it out. Now, Theaetetus, in response to Socrates, he says to the question, you like the suggestion, you say, that false judgment is other judging. Theaetetus says, yes, I do. Then according to your judgment, it is possible to set down a thing in one's thought as another thing and not itself. Theaetetus says, surely it is. Now, when a man's thought is accomplishing this, isn't it essential that he should be thinking of either one or both of these two things? Theaetetus says it is essential, either both together or each in turn. Very good. Now, by thinking, just thinking in quotes, do you mean the same as I do? Theaetetus says, what do you mean by it? A talk which the soul has with itself about the objects under its consideration. Of course, I'm only telling you my idea in all ignorance. But this is the kind of picture I have of it. It seems to me that the soul, when it thinks it is simply carrying on a discussion in which it asks itself questions and answers them itself, affirms and denies. And when it arrives at something definite, either by a gradual process or a sudden leap, when it affirms one thing consistently and without divided counsel, we call this its judgment. So, in my view, to judge is to make a statement, and a judgment is a statement, which is not addressed to another person or spoken aloud, but silently addressed to oneself. And what do you think? Now, I think this statement by Socrates here goes well with what we were saying about the object preceding nothingness. And he says that thinking is equivalent to a talk with the soul about the objects beneath its consideration. That means its consideration is dependent upon the objects. And that communication with the soul, that talk with the soul, exactly what that means, perhaps the inner dialogue, it is the communication between two parts, more than one part of the brain. But again, this type of analogizing to the The concrete material doesn't really help us here, I don't think. But a talk with the soul. Again, the soul, as we were thinking earlier, is the grand in some sense it's the grand unifier, the grand director, the grand integrator. I think that might be the best that we have described it as, the grand integrator. It's the head honcho in the hierarchy of our being. But what exactly does it mean to have a talk with the soul? It seems to consider more than one thing, the soul being this our seat of being, and it has this elevated status. Now it's communicating necessarily with the levels beneath it. And so what might we consider the levels beneath the soul? Do we consider it to be primarily the things that build the soul and what it is, the sort of emergent properties of the soul? But what exactly does that mean? Perhaps it's something within us that produces the inferior levels. And here, inferior levels, I think, has to do with difficult to describe, surely. But these inferior levels, they have their own, perhaps their agency to it. Now we have to remember that the soul is we can think of it now, at least, until we change our definition, of the grand unifier as pulling pieces of the self together. And again, also integrating sense perception together to make sense of the world. And surely there are different pieces of the self. We have different ways of feeling. We have different modes that we seem to put ourselves in. Certainly we are different when we are operating in a professional setting. We are taking on a responsibility that involves other people, that doesn't just involve ourselves. We are different in that situation than we are as we are about to go to bed at night, or we are talking with a loved one. Our responsibilities may still be quite lofty, but the relationship differs. And this talk with the soul certainly is a relationship. So I think we'll keep that for now, and we'll come back to that thought later. And I think it's possible that through the rest of the Socrates' explanation in this paragraph, we might be able to flesh out some more of it. Now his next statement is, of course, I'm only telling you my idea in all ignorance. But it gives a bit of context, I think, to the conversation that we are having about judging what is false. Because certainly we are judging. We are judging relative to something. And although we are without concrete thingness, we are talking about relative thingness. We are talking about the idea of something existing in reality. And the irony is we are making judgments about things that certainly can be false. But again, even in this abstract realm, we are not making judgments about nothing at all. Again, the conversation with the soul about the objects under its consideration. It seems to me that the soul, when it thinks, is simply carrying on a discussion in which it asks itself questions and answers them itself, affirms and denies. Certainly, I think we can see this. But now in this sentence we have this hypothetical discussion with the individual, the soul. This discussion is now between the soul asking itself. And perhaps it's not. It has nothing to do with the lower layers. But the soul is the grand decider. And perhaps all of the debate happens at the upper level. But surely it is challenged by the lower levels, I have to imagine. It's challenged by desires, by temptation. Things that are not at the top, that cannot make the grand decision. Ultimately, it is the soul that makes the decision. And in cases of inferiority, if it chooses that, then we may suffer the consequences. But again, this is going down a different road. But it's just a matter to keep our hypothetical alive and to run through these possible levels. But considering the soul having a dialogue with itself, I think it's an interesting one. Certainly we all have it to a certain degree. We have conversations with ourselves about a great many things. Affirming and denying things. And when it arrives at something definite, either by a gradual process or a sudden leap, when it affirms one thing consistently and without divided counsel, we call this its judgment. So, in my view, to judge is to make a statement. And a judgment is a statement which is not addressed to another person or spoken loud, but silently addressed to oneself. So it is under conviction that the soul says, I have judged appropriately, and I believe this to be true. When it arrives at something definite, something that is convincing enough for it to stand firm. Now it can be whatever this process might look like. It can be rather sophisticated or not. Now Theaetetus says, I agree with that. Socrates says, so that when a man judges one thing to be another, what he is doing, apparently, is to say to himself that the one thing is the other. Theaetetus says, yes, of course. Now try to think if you have ever said to yourself, surely the beautiful is ugly, or the just, or the unjust is certainly the just. Or, to put it in the most general terms, have you ever tried to persuade yourself that surely one thing is another? Wouldn't the very opposite of this be the truth? Wouldn't the truth be that not even in your sleep have you ever gone so far as to say that to yourself? No doubt odd is the even, or anything of that kind? Theaetetus says, yes, that's so. And do you think that anyone else, in his right mind or out of it, ever ventured seriously to tell himself, with the hope of winning his own assent, that a cow must be a horse, or two must be one? Theaetetus says, no, indeed I don't. Well, then, if to make a statement to oneself is to judge, no one who makes a statement that is a judgment about both things, getting hold of both with the soul, can state or judge that one is the other. And you, in your turn, must let this form of words pass. What I mean by it is this: no one judges the ugly as beautiful, or makes any other such judgment. Theaetetus says, all right, Socrates, I pass it, and I think you're right. Socrates says, thus a man who has both things before his mind, when he judges, cannot possibly judge that one is the other. So it seems. But if he has only one of them before his mind in judging, and the other is not present to him at all, he will never judge that one is the other. Theaetetus says that's true, for he would have to have hold also of the one that is not present to his judgment. Then other judging is not possible for anyone either when he has both things present to him in judgment, or when he has only one. So, if anyone is going to define false judgment as heterodoxy, he will be saying nothing. The existence of false judgment in us cannot be shown in this way any more than by our previous approaches. Theaetetus says it seems not. And yet, Theaetetus, if it is not shown to exist, we shall be driven into admitting a number of absurdities. And what would they be? I'm not going to tell you until I have tried every possible way of looking at this matter. I should be ashamed to see us forced into making the kind of admissions I mean while we are still in difficulties. If we find that we are after and become free men, then we will turn around and talk about how these things happen to other people, having secured our own persons against ridicule. While if we can't find any way of extricating ourselves, then I suppose we shall be laid low, like seasick passengers, and give ourselves into the hands of the argument and let it trample all over us and do what it likes with us. And now let me tell you where I see a way still open to this inquiry. Now there's part of me when I reflect on the previous passage, there's a part of me that says that what they are talking about is extremely obvious. There's a part of me that doesn't quite understand the thought experiment of this other judging. There's part of me thinks that I'm missing part of the story here. But I think it's important to reorient and to determine exactly what it is that we are after here. So we are after what is knowledge. We've just come off of a rather long and lengthy discussion about some historical beliefs of the time of Protagoras. We need not get into the specifics of his beliefs, but we have since passed that by, and we are in new territory. I believe we've come to understand that there are inherent limitations with experience, And that comes with our hardware, we can say. And that is to say that among the various things that we are able to perceive of our environment, it is but a slice of that environment. Now, it need not be something that is provoking of a negative feeling, but rather it's a recognition of our place in the world and our abilities therein. And so the conversation seems to shift. And it shifts into the level of existence and of truth. Now, again, talking about Protagoras, we've had lengthy discussions about relativism, about subjectivism, that man is the measure of all things, all this sort of thing. We've moved past that. And Socrates proposes the question a while ago. He says, now is it possible for someone who does not even get at being to get at truth? And so there is something fundamental about understanding existence. And grasping at this existence is somehow a way for us to get closer to some sort of truth. We have a recognition that there is a certain base level of fundamental experience that we all share just by virtue of, again, our hardware. But there's a level beyond that that requires decisiveness, discipline, to ensure a proper development. And what exactly are we developing? Well, this has to do with being, it has to do with their existence. I think it has to do with the relationship, another thing that Socrates is talking about. This being, this relationship of existence, and their role, perhaps, in the world. The failure of the cultivation of this relationship leads to the failure of knowing. Socrates says, knowledge is found not in the experiences, but in the process of reasoning about them. It is here, seemingly, not in the experiences, that it is possible to grasp being and truth. And we say so because of not only the finitude of our experience, but also the potential for falsehood, which I think is perhaps why we have moved the trajectory of the conversation into judgment. But it lies not in experiences. We have at least these two reasons why we believe that it is not within the experience, but rather the reasoning therein. The reasoning about these experiences. Now, from our participation with the world, we are able to grasp at our existence. And once we are able to grasp at our fundamental being, then again, this moves us closer to a truth. Now, practically how this plays out is difficult to say just at face value. It seems like it sounds good. We also have our advancement that, at least in this conversation, that perception is not knowledge. And we say this because it has no share in grasping the truth, since it has none in the grasping of being. And perhaps we say this because the grasping of being involves the integrator. It involves the soul. It is beyond the fundamentals, we could say. Fundamentals of base reality. Of the hot, of the cold, of the wet and the dry, of the pressure, and of the position in space, of the reflection of light, of the vibration that makes its way into our ears so that we can hear. Not these. But it's what we do when we think of them that leads us to some truth. Because it's involved in something deeper. It is, again, an integration. Which I think fundamentally being requires. Although it is another sort of form of a base level that is being, that is existence. It's very foundational. Socrates also makes the concession that we've made little progress in determining what knowledge is. We've determined what it is not. And we sort of started the conversation over again. It's not like we haven't gone anywhere. We've gone quite a few places. But like there are many tributaries off of a large river, we have to return to the main body. And our exploration of the tributary perhaps was long, but it was also full of experiences, things that we can reflect on and learn from. And it's not to our detriment that when we return to the main body of the river, that we should feel any sort of way about our lack of movement, let's say, in terms of the main body of water. And on our reorganization back to the main body, we landed on Theaetetus saying something about judgment. In response to Socrates' question, tell me again, what is knowledge? Theaetetus says, well, Socrates, one can't say that it is judgment in general, because there is also false judgment. But true judgment may well be knowledge. So within true judgment, so now necessarily we are going down the road of, okay, what is judgment? What is true judgment? Socrates is bothered by this idea of false judgment, so he explores it. We explore the idea of things being known or not known, this being the totality of all. We come to the conclusion that, no, this is too simplistic, there has to be something else. Socrates says, then perhaps we better take up a different line of inquiry. Perhaps we should proceed not by way of knowing and not knowing, but by way of being and not being. And so we begin our slow march with the conversation about false judgment, which is where we have been thus far. So I think I will end this episode here. We will continue next time with the Platonic dialogue Theaetetus.